Okay, perfect. So I think we should begin. Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, The Impact of Cycling Infrastructure on Bike Commuting. This webinar is brought to you by Hub Cycling and its members. Hub Cycling is a nonprofit charitable organization whose mission is to get more people cycling more often. We accomplish this through advocacy, education, events, research, and consulting. You can find more information on our website, bikehub.ca. Next slide, please. On behalf of Hub Cycling and Angie Weddell, our presenter, I would like to acknowledge, respect, and celebrate the Indigenous nations on whose treaty unceded territories we are fortunate to live, work, and operate. In working towards a better and safer infrastructure system, Hub and its program have a role to play in the reconciliation work with the Indigenous people of the region. Great. So my name is Marcela Garcia. I'm the event and volunteer coordinator for Hub Cycling and will be moderating today's session. Just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. As you listen to the presentation, please use the chat function to ask questions. We'll give Angie plenty of time at the end of to answer selected questions. As a reminder, the meeting will be recorded. Please do not record the meeting and do not share sensitive or personal information in the chat. We will be posting this webinar on our YouTube channel in a few days, and we'll also follow up this webinar with email containing any relevant information mentioned in the presentation. Cool. So with that, we're so excited to welcome Angie Weddell today as she introduces and delves into her research on bike route comfort labels change how often people choose to cycle to work in Metro Vancouver region. Angie is an engineer in training in the community transportation branch at the City of Vancouver, working on neighborhood traffic management. She is passionate about using data to advance equity and providing sustainable transportation choices that work for everyone. The research mentioned in the presentation was undertaken as part of Angie's advanced certificate in GIS from BCIT, independently from Angie's work at the city, and it does not represent the views of the City of Vancouver. On that note, welcome Angie. Thank you so much for being here, and please take it away.
Thanks so much. Let me just get my screen share set up and we will go. All right, can everyone hear me and see the presentation?
Yes, I think you're good to go.
Excellent. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks to Hub for hosting this and to Marcela for introducing me. So again, my name is Angie Weddell. I work at the City of Vancouver in neighborhood traffic management, but today I'm going to be taking off my City of Vancouver hat and putting on kind of my personal research hat. So in 2020, I completed the GIS Advanced Certificate Program at BCIT, and I did this analysis as part of my capstone project, and kind of put it on hold for a year or so, and finally was able to come back to it in 2022 and kind of finish up the analysis and put together this presentation, which is on the impact of cycling infrastructure on bike commuting and how proximity and quality of cycle infrastructure impact biking. So first off, let's have a couple of definitions of things that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. So first definition, I'm going to be using the term cycling commute mode share, and I'm probably going to shorten that to mode share a lot of the time. So this is basically the percent of the population who cycle to work. So this is kind of the unit of analysis that I'm using to measure, how often people bike. The next thing is census-tract. So this is a geographic area that's used by Statistics Canada. It varies in population and in area, But the basic idea is that, you know, there's normally a few thousand people in each of these census tracts, and it kind of is approximately kind of a neighborhood. And the last term is proximity, which that just means how close you are to something. It's basically the inverse of distance, or how far away you are from something. If there are any other terms that I use that you're not sure what they mean, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'll keep half an eye on that. I'll save kind of larger questions to the end, but if you have any kind of clarifying questions, I will try to hit those as I go along. So I think we're all here, you know, we're all excited about cycling. We're all interested in the ways that we can make cycling more accessible for people, how we can convince more people to cycle, and kind of a review of what we know about the factors that influence cycling mode share, or the likelihood of people to cycle. So there are kind of socioeconomic factors. So these are things like, for instance, you know, that certain groups are more likely to cycle than other groups. So for instance, men tend to be more likely to cycle than women, and younger people tend to be more likely to cycle than older folks. And there's also been some research on other factors like education or ethnicity. And while there's been a number of research papers on that, there hasn't been kind of a clear trend for those. So definitely more research is needed. Cost is another factor. So that's both the cost of cycling itself, and also the cost of alternative modes. So the cost of driving or transit might influence people's likelihood to bike. There are environmental factors. So slope in general, you know, steeper slopes or more change in elevation tends to be associated with less cycling. And weather has a big impact as well. So people are more likely to cycle when it's sunny and less likely to cycle when it's rainy and windy. The next kind of area is the built environment. So there is distance, and that's kind of a factor really of land use. So when you have denser land uses where, you know, amenities and jobs are close to people's homes, you tend to see more cycling. And also cycling facilities. So more cycling infrastructure is associated with more cycling. And the last area is perception. So people have perceptions of these factors that affect their willingness to bike. So if people perceive Vancouver to be very rainy, they may be less likely to bike, even if we have many beautiful days like today, even in the middle of November. And lastly, kind of the perception of safety. So the idea of, you know, when people perceive infrastructure to be unsafe or cycling to be unsafe, they're going to be less likely to cycle. And this kind of leads to the questions that I'm going to be looking at in this research, kind of in this last area of built environment and perception. So the basic ideas the basic questions that I want to answer are, is proximity to bikeways associated with higher cycling mode share? And does the perceived safety of the bikeway make a difference? And this is kind of building off some research that was done in 2017, looking at the cities of Montreal and Vancouver, that found that proximity to bikeways does increase cycling mode share. So this research was completed by Teskey, Brower, and Chin, and they used the 2011 census data and bikeway data for the two cities to do their analysis. And they found that those living 1 kilometer closer to any bikeway were 4 times more likely to cycle to work. And they found that this kind of association was even greater for women, so 5.7 times as opposed to 4 times. They also took a look at the effect of different cycling facilities. So there were 4 cycling facilities that they looked at. Cycle tracks, which are often called protected bike lanes in Vancouver, painted bike lanes, residential street bikeways, which are sometimes called local street bikeways or bike boulevards in some places, and off-street bike paths. And what they found was quite interesting. So in Montreal, all of the bikeway types had a positive effect on cycling mode share. And in Vancouver, only local street bikeways and cycle tracks had a positive effect on cycling mode share. And they suggested they thought that this suggested that perhaps it wasn't so much the individual bikeway type that was most important, but rather that all different bikeway types coming together form a network. So in Montreal, it was all 4 of these bikeway types, formed a network that made it so people could get from their homes to their workplaces easily on bikes. In Vancouver, we have kind of a network of protected bike lanes or cycle tracks in the downtown area, and in the rest of the city, we have a network of these local street bikeways. So those 2 networks together had positive effects on cycling mode share. But this kind of analysis can be quite difficult when you're looking at multiple jurisdictions. Not only do we have kind of issues of nomenclature, like for instance, protected bike lanes versus cycle tracks, they're generally the same thing, but called different things. But sometimes even you have the same word being used or the same term being used for quite different types of bikeways. So in the background, you can see just some examples of the different bikeway classification systems that are used in the Vancouver area. But you might have, for instance, somebody calling something a local street bikeway, where in Vancouver, local street bikeways all are signed at 30 kilometers an hour, but that might be the case, not be the case in another jurisdiction. So your experience on those bike routes that are called the same thing might be quite different. And an example of this is in 2016, both of these bike routes were classified as off-street bicycle routes. So on the left, you have the seawall in Vancouver, which is totally separated from traffic, and it has very few even intersections where you intersect with vehicles. Bikes are separated from pedestrians and have quite a wide path to themselves. Whereas on the right, you have the Patillo Bridge between New West and Surrey, where you have 2 directions of bike traffic and pedestrian traffic on a very narrow sidewalk. And, there's no, at least at the time that this photo was taken and that I did this analysis, there was no separation between you and the cars on the other side, just basically a curb, a sidewalk. I know there have been some changes to that recently. Oh, I thought that there was some protection put in at some point in time, but if not, in any case, you can see that, even those are both maybe technically off-street bicycle routes, your experience with them is going to be very, very different. And so to kind of address this issue, Hub and TransLink in 2019 completed the State of Cycling report. So this classifies bike routes across the entire Metro Vancouver region, not by bikeway type, but by comfort. So by a cyclist experience, into 4 categories, from comfortable for most, all the way to comfortable for very few. And the way this was done, so this is a map showing the entire network. There are kind of 5 factors that were used to classify these bike routes. So separation from motor vehicles, so whether you're on the street with vehicles or in some kind of protected facility. And then if you are in with motor vehicles, then looking at motor vehicle speeds, volumes, and the presence of parking. And as well width for both on-street and separated facilities. So all of these factors go in to classify the bike routes across the whole region into these 4 categories. And just kind of to give you an idea of what kind of facilities tend to end up in which category. So in comfortable for most, this is where we find our dedicated bike paths, protected bike lanes, and many local street bikeways that are kind of traffic calmed with low speeds. As well, we find many multi-use paths. So these are shared between cyclists and pedestrians, and sometimes folks like skaters or skateboarders as well. And both paved and unpaved multi-use paths end up in this category. For comfortable for some, this is where we start to see more of our on-street facilities. So painted bike lanes and bike accessible shoulders, which are quite similar. The difference being that a painted bike lane has a curb, whereas the bike accessible shoulder, you can see there's no actual curb between kind of the bike facility and the edge of the roadway. We also see shared major roads, as well as some local street bikeways and paved multi-use paths that don't meet the criteria of being kind of wide enough, low volume, or low speed enough. And then for comfortable for a few and very few, we see these same basic bikeway types, but we're basically, these are facilities where we have super high volumes or high speeds that are leading to these bikeways being not very comfortable. And even a very small number of kind of more local street bikeways, if they have higher volumes and speeds, or paved multi-use paths that you know, are very narrow next to kind of high speed traffic. And so now we see these two bikeways that we were looking at earlier. We can classify them and see that, you know, the seawall is classified as comfortable for most, and the Patello Bridge is classified as comfortable for very few. So these are kind of properly classified. They're no longer the same bikeway type. So I'm going to walk you through kind of the details of my analysis now, and talk about the different data sources I used and how I used them. So there are kind of 5 different data sources that went into this. So the first one is census-tract. So we talked about what those are earlier. Just to kind of give you a sense of the scale here, census-tracts, there are 478 of them in the Metro Vancouver area. I did remove 8 of them because they either didn't have any population, or no commuter population, or no female population. And I also ended up removing Bowen Island because in 2016, I used census data from 2016, which was the most recent census data that was available. So at that time, Bowen Island didn't actually have any bike routes of their own. So you'd have to take a ferry in order to get to the closest bike route. So that census tract was removed as well. So basically for each census tract, I calculated the cycling mode share using the 2016 Journey to Work data, which is a census data set that deals with people's commutes. And then for each census tract, I also figured out what the average distance to a bikeway was. And I'll take you through that in a bit more detail in a couple more slides. Next up, we have parcels and zoning. So basically the idea is that within each census tract, we have parcels, and those are being used to kind of represent people's homes. And the start points for the analysis. And then zoning data was used to remove all the parcels that weren't in a residential area. So if a parcel was in an area that's zoned exclusively for industrial or commercial use, it was removed. And so basically what we have left are the parcels that are in residential areas where people can live. One note about that is just that this doesn't take into account how many people actually live in each parcel. So, you know, you might have some parcels that are in a residential area, but maybe it's just a vacant home, or maybe the parcel is being used for something else that's allowed in a residential zone, like a school or a community center. And you might also have parcels in a residential area that have hundreds of residents because, you know, they're an apartment building, a high rise, and lots of people live there. And I didn't use any kind of population measure. So all parcels within a residential area are kind of treated equally. Next up, we have our bike routes and road network. So the bike routes was that data set from Hub and TransLink with the classification based on comfort. However, that work was done in 2019. And so I did need to do some work to kind of review it and manually remove routes that were built kind of in those years from 2016 to 2019, or in some cases kind of reclassify a route that had been upgraded in that time. The road network was the BC government's digital road atlas, which is basically a network that shows, all the roads within the province. And the reason I had to use this was because I wanted to get, the actual distance from each parcel to a bike route if you went along the road network. So not kind of as the crow flies, but actually what you would likely do where you have to go along the roads. And there was some additional work to be done to make sure that those two, the bike routes and the road network, kind of matched up with each other. And then for the bike routes data set, I created nodes every 50 meters. So these are essentially like points along the bike route that represent access points onto the bikeway. And the idea here is that I'm essentially you can think of it as, you're on Google Maps and you are at a location and you say, where is the closest pharmacy to where I am? And Google will show you the closest pharmacy along the road network. And so I'm doing a similar kind of analysis where I'm saying, this parcel is my start point and these nodes along the bikeway are my endpoints. Show me the shortest route between my parcel and one of those nodes. And then I ran that analysis for each type of bikeway, so each of those comfort classifications. I will walk you through it in a little bit more detail because it's a little bit complicated. So here we have a census tract. This is in Burnaby, and those gray lines within the pink blob are all our parcels. Next up, if we remove parcels in areas that are not zoned for residential use, we come up with these bright pink parcels. So these are all of our start points, essentially. I'm going to zoom into one of the parcels on the right. If we go in and zoom in to this parcel, run the analysis and say, okay, to get to a comfortable for most bikeway, how far is that? That's 17 meters. It's basically from the center of this parcel just out to the street in front is a comfortable for most bikeway. Okay, how far is it from this parcel to a comfortable for some bikeway? Well, those are the yellow lines. So that is up the street here. It's 242 meters. Next analysis, how far are we from a comfortable for few bikeway? Well, that's down the street in the other way, 161 meters. And it just so happens that that's an intersection of, there's also a comfortable for very few bikeway. So that happens to be the same. And of course, I didn't do this analysis manually. I automated it using Python, but basically for each one of these parcels, I ran these 4 analyses and then took the average for the census tract. So if we go back to our census tract, overall, the average distance to any bikeway is 0.4 kilometers, and the average distance to a comfortable for most bikeway is 0.5 kilometers, and so on. And what I found, so I have my cycling mode share data. So that's, what % of people cycle to work. And then I have my distance to bikeways data. What I found was that, the closer you are to a bikeway, the more likely you are to cycle. So you can see over here on the left, we have a map showing the cycling mode share for the region. And then over on the right, I've kind of aggregated all the census tracts where the cycling mode share is 0. You can see that the average distance to any bikeway is around half a kilometer. And as we get to these kind of higher mode shares, so 5 to 7 and greater than 7, we're looking at closer to 200 meters for the distance to any bikeway. So the highest mode shares are the closest to the bikeways. And to kind of actually quantify this relationship, I did some statistical analysis, which found that those living 1 kilometer closer to any bikeway were 5 times more likely to cycle to work, which is quite in line with the previous research on Vancouver and Montreal. But what I thought was really interesting was that only comfortable for most bikeways had an effect on mode share, had a relationship with mode share. So I ran this analysis for each of the bikeway types separately. Those living 1 kilometer closer to a comfortable for most bikeway were 6.6 times more likely to cycle to work. And no other route types had associations with mode share. So living closer to a comfortable for some few or very few bikeway was not associated with any kind of increase in mode share. And I also ran this analysis separately for men and women. So the data from the census provided kind of disaggregated data for women and men as of 2016. I know that in 2021, there is going to be another gender category for non-binary folks, but that data was not available for me when I did this analysis. So looking at women and men, that proximity effect was even greater. So they were 11.1 times more likely to cycle to work, living 1 kilometer closer to a comfortable for most bikeway. And seeing that how strong the relationship was for comfortable for most bikeways for everyone, but women in particular really drove home the point to me about how important this type of infrastructure is. So I guess kind of wrapping things up, I have a couple of key takeaways, and then we'll go into questions. So I think, the data says it very clearly, only comfortable for most bikeways are associated with increased cycling mode share. So if you are, someone here who works in, transportation infrastructure, if you are somebody who advocates for biking or, bikes yourself, if that's important to you, I think it's really, really key to, share with the people who are building bike infrastructure where you live that, there's no point in building these uncomfortable bike facilities like painted bike lanes or sharrows. That's not going to have an effect on people's likelihood to bike. My second point is that, when you're designing bike infrastructure, you need to make sure that it kind of meets that standard. So it's not enough to just kind of say this local street is a bikeway. You need to make sure that it actually has the low speeds and volumes that are going to make it comfortable for most, because we saw in the data earlier that, not every type of local street bikeway or off-street path really meets that standard. So make sure that you're hitting all of those points and getting to that comfortable for most standard. And lastly, just providing comfortable for most infrastructure is an equity issue. So no group, all commuters, women or men, had an association with any other bikeway type other than comfortable for most. But you could see that, for women, it was almost, the effect was almost doubled for women as it was for all commuters. So it is really important to provide this infrastructure to make sure that cycling is accessible to all groups. Lastly, I wanted to make a couple of notes about kind of future research. So, I think that the analysis from this and the results from this are really powerful, but there are obviously other things that impact people's likelihood to bike. So one element is about determining causality. So this research shows that there's a relationship between the distance to bikeways and cycling mode share, but it doesn't say the direction of that. So it might be that, where people live closer to bikeways, that makes them more likely to bike. It could also be that people who want to bike choose to live close to bikeways. And, likely that, there's maybe a little column A and a little column B. So one way to address this would be to repeat the analysis with, the most recent census data and look specifically at areas where the bike network has changed. So where you either have new routes or, upgraded routes, and see if there's a corresponding change in mode share. Another element is kind of including some element of kind of connectivity, intersection design, network effects to determine, to kind of look at that as well, because we're only looking here at, how far it is from your home to the nearest bikeway. This analysis doesn't look at, does that bikeway actually take you where you want to go? Can you, is that bikeway kind of continuous the whole way, or do you have a situation where you need to cross a busy street without a light, or where the bikeway just sort of ends and doesn't go anywhere? So including that element could also be very valuable. And the last thing would be to kind of look at other demographic groups. So this analysis showed that women, for women, the effect of being close to a comfortable for most bikeway was even more than for all commuters. So it would be really interesting to look at other demographic groups as well and see if the effects are different for these other groups. So I know that there have been some great questions in the chat, which I'll take a look at in just a second. Before I do that, though, I want to thank a couple people. So firstly, I need to thank Dr. Kay Teskey, who has provided just invaluable assistance to me in terms of this project, both in terms of methodology and help with the statistics. So thank you so much to Dr. Teskey. And secondly, Hub Cycling and TransLink. So in addition to putting on this webinar, which is fantastic, Hub and TransLink also provided the original Bikeways data set to me. So that, was really important and necessary to doing this work. So thanks so much. I'm gonna stop the screen share and I think pass it over to Marcela, who will kind of guide the questions from here.
Awesome. Yeah, so thank you so very much, Angie, for providing with us a lot of information and lessons that policymakers and along with cycling advocates can take on this call. We do have a couple questions. So I think we should just get started. First question I have here is from Gavin. It says, Angie, in your presentation, you indicated that networks had an impact on people's propensity to ride. Was that consideration part of your study in this case?
Yeah, so I didn't look directly at networks, but I do kind of have a takeaway, looking at the previous research and my research currently. So, the previous research found that, certain bikeway types in Vancouver, at least protected bike lanes and local street bikeways were, associated with higher mode shares. And they surmised that that had to do, with the networks created by these bikeway types. And both of these bikeway types are kind of contained in the comfortable for most kind of umbrella, at least for the most part. So I think it's fair to say that, these bikeway types do form a network in the Vancouver area, which does have an effect on cycling. And so, in the future, I'd love to include a kind of more direct measure of network, because I do think that that's an important element. And, there were definitely some kind of comfortable for most bikeways where it was just like a little green squiggle on the map, and it did not connect to anything. And I'm not really convinced that something like that is going to have a huge effect. So yeah, that's definitely something I could see looking into in the future.
Perfect. I hope that answered your question, Gavin. The next question we have is from Stephen, and then they're asking, why are gravel pathways ranked lower than sharing the lane on a busy street with cars? Some of them are quite nice and pleasant to ride.
So I don't think that is the case, actually. So for the most part, gravel paths, like multi-use paths, were classified as comfortable for most, if they were kind of wide enough to support, mixed use on them. So, there were some that weren't. But yeah, incomfortable for most, it's a variety of facilities, including, local street bikeways where you are mixed with cars. But those gravel paths, for the most part, were in the mix there, in the comfortable for most. Maybe you can read me the next question, but I'll bring up just the map to show a couple of things.
Sure, I'll move on to the next one. This one also from Stephen. Did you analyze living 0.5 kilometers from comfortable facilities? I wonder if the rate are the same as 1 kilometer or more.
Yeah, so just first to just share this map. So for instance, it's a bit hard to see. You have to definitely know the facilities. But for instance, this right here is like the Central Valley Greenway, which a large part of it is gravel, and you can see that is green. The Fraser River Trail down here, parts of that are gravel as well, and they are also green. So I don't know. I guess another one here is Railway in Richmond, or not Railway, sorry, the Dyke Trail in Richmond, which is also comfortable for most. So as far as the other question goes, so the sort of 1 kilometer closer proximity metric, it's kind of a feature of the way that this kind of statistical analysis is done. So basically, it's a little actually it's a little hard to explain, I would say, but the idea, is that there's a relationship between distance and bikeways. So we say, and it's a negative relationship essentially. So you can say, the further you are from a bikeway, or the larger that distance is, the less likely people are going to be to bike. So that's a negative relationship. And then, in order to get the relative rate of cycling, you then essentially kind of invert that relationship that's negative, and that gives you the rate of cycling, or the relative rate of, like, for each kilometer closer you are, you're this much more likely to bike. So you could do that on a half kilometer basis, but it wouldn't really change the underlying like equation that governs that statistical relationship. So,
right.
Happy to share the paper with a little bit more detail, but it gets into the weeds statistically a little bit.
Yeah, I think we might be sending around after the call more resources to people they can look at. We have another question from Gerald. They state, since 2016, we have seen a surge in e-bikes with other micro-mobility devices. We also had a pandemic which accelerated interest in cycling. Any hypothesis on how an update study would be done?
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. This work was based on the 2016 census, because that was the most recent data that was available. Obviously, a lot has changed in the past few years. People's commutes have changed. Maybe they're commuting less often. E-bikes are huge and really changing or providing a lot more people with the option to bike, especially for kind of longer distances, or where there's more change in elevation. So I think the way that this study is designed, if I were to just do a simple update to it, it probably, just the way it's set up, it probably wouldn't there wouldn't be a huge way to incorporate that. But I think if you looked at something like the distance of people's commutes and their likelihood to bike, I wouldn't be surprised if you'd see a change. If you'd see that people are more likely to bike long distances, and a big part of that is e-bikes.
Yeah, definitely. So the next question, sorry, I'm moving on because we have a list of questions and I will make sure we get them all. So the next one is from Erin. For future research, would you consider including the effects of awareness of CFM bikeways, including wayfinding, signage, local promotion, or cycling events?
I think that all of that stuff is important. It's a lot harder to incorporate into this kind of analysis. You'd have to do some kind of survey or something of people. It's very convenient, of course, when you can use census data because somebody else has gone to the trouble to write the questions and collect the data and put it into nice tables for you to use. So to do something like that, I think you'd have to kind of design your own survey and then get people to respond. And then there's always difficulties to make sure that you're getting a representative sample. So I think that kind of research is super interesting. For me personally, that's probably not something that I'm going to do, but I would love to see somebody else's research on that in that capacity. So.
Yeah, definitely. So the next one is my question, actually. So you mentioned the topography at the beginning. Does the census data show how much an impact topography has on people biking to work across Metro Vancouver, Richmond, which is relatively flat, versus North Vancouver, which is very mountainy, as an example?
Yeah, so the previous paper did look at kind of the slope from the houses to the nearest bikeway, and definitely found that generally a higher slope was related to lower biking. It had a negative impact on biking. This study and that previous study don't look at the entire route. So it might be that to get to your bikeway, it's a bit of a steep slope, but then it's very flat, or vice versa. So I think in order to look into that in more detail, you'd have to know more information about people's entire routes. So where they're starting and where they're stopping, and the elevation gain between those. But again, I think that this is something where e-bikes can have a huge impact, of making what might have been a really challenging climb for somebody into, something much more accessible to more people. So we might see in the future that there's really, that slopes have a smaller impact than previously because of kind of the rise of e-bikes.
Right, yeah, more accessible. Yeah, thank you for your answer. The next one is from Jack. They want to know if Python analysis code available anywhere. They would be interested in trying to run a similar analysis for their area.
Yeah, I am more than happy to share it. I should probably get it on GitHub or something so people can access it more easily. But I would say just, reach out to Hub and they'll pass your info on to me, and I'm more than happy to send that to you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think everyone has their contact information. If not, you can visit our website to get a hold of us. And then the next question is, or comment. So Gavin has a comment and a question. They say, "Hi Angie, great work. Thank you. Great work. Thank you. It's very comforting to hear that Hub's research into constitute a comfortable route is accurate and that it does have an impact on ridership. Is there any more research that is needed to tease out what aspects of the route make them comfortable for most?"
Yeah, I think that this is a really good question. And I know that, in order to do this classification, obviously some assumptions had to be made about bike routes. And, for instance, the threshold in terms of vehicles per day for comfortable for most, I believe is 2,000. That sounds pretty reasonable to me. I know that the City of Vancouver uses 1,000 for their AAA routes. And so determining exactly what that number is, you know, it probably bears some more kind of thought about exactly what it should be. And, you know, there are so many other factors, like parking is important, but also, you know, is the parking actually being used frequently? Or, you know, is parking just allowed? Like it's really complicated, and it's really easy to get bogged down in the details. So, you know, I don't want to let perfect be the enemy of good here. I think, you know, Hub's done a great job of doing this work. You know, there's maybe some fine tuning that could be done to improve it a little bit. But, you know, these are broad categories, and it's okay. You know, I don't want Hub to be spending all of their money and effort like doing traffic counts on every road in the region. I don't know that that's a good use of money. But yeah, I think, you know, keeping an eye on the research about, you know, proximity to vehicles and seeing if any sort of more detailed information comes out about, you know, the relationships between speeds and volumes might update it in the future, but I think it's pretty good for now.
Oh, great, thank you. And I think we have one last question. It's did you find if there was any correlation between more people cycling due to an increase in gas prices?
Yeah, so this is not something I looked at, and census data, you know, it only comes out every 5 years, so it's a bit hard to do something kind of fine-grained. You can obviously look at the average gas price at that time. You know, this is another thing where I think maybe a kind of more targeted survey might be more effective to get that relationship. Certainly previous research has shown that cost, including the cost of other modes. So, you know, if the cost of driving goes up due to gas prices or insurance or something else, that does tend to lead to an uptick in cycling. So I think that, you know, previous research has seen that effect. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same right now with the increased gas prices.
Very interesting to know. I lied, there's other questions, sorry. The other question is, especially on the point of e-bikes that you mentioned, how do you think that the City of Vancouver designed policy to promote an uptake on e-bikes?
I would say that is not my area of expertise. So I'm not going to kind of to say that I'm an expert in this. You know, I know that there are concerns, you know, about e-bikes and other micromobility devices going a lot faster than they're supposed to. And I know that that's a concern, you know, that some people who are, you know, cycling on acoustic bikes or, you know, walking, people have concerns about kind of those speeds. And so making sure that those devices are in line with the City of Vancouver requirement, which I believe is 32 kilometers an hour is the top speed. I think that's important. I know that there's been some talk about, you know, maybe incentives or things like that. You know, I think something like that could be great, whether it's the city or somebody else who's doing that, I'm not sure. But yeah, I would love to see more folks on bikes. So, you know, whatever we can do to get folks comfortable, whether that's, you know, e-bikes or not. Yeah, I would love to see that.
Yeah, definitely. And more people cycling more often. This is the last question. Yeah, again, something that may not be in your area of expertise and maybe more of a personal question, but Kelly wants to know, what do you think about the other modalities sharing the bike lane?
Yeah, so, you know, I think that, you know, one thing that is interesting about the Hub classification is that it does include multi-use paths, which have other modes, pedestrians, but also sometimes, you know, skateboarders and other things using that lane or using that facility. I think the thing about, you know, I think it really depends on the width of the facility and how many people are using it. There's a certain point where you need to separate it out. And for some of these facilities, we might not be there yet. You know, something like the Central Valley Greenway, which has, you know, a big commute population, but it's also kind of a recreational facility, and it's quite wide in some places, at least. You know, I wouldn't say that needs to be separated out right away, but you know, it's just something to kind of keep an eye on as you go forward, and you know, make adjustments to the network as needed if you're seeing, you know, really high volumes.
Yeah, thank you. I am mindful of the time. We do have another question, but I want to know if like you want to wrap up or continue with the Q&A.
Yeah, I'm happy to take more questions. I will say I'm seeing this here. I don't know anything about the rapid transit stations. You know, I don't think the census has a great way of capturing multimodal trips. You know, so the idea of somebody like biking to a rapid transit station and then taking the SkyTrain the rest of the way, you know, I see that as being you know, great, especially for longer commutes. But I don't think we have great data on that now. So definitely something that needs more research in the future. Yeah, and I am happy to kind of leave it here and let people have a couple minutes before their lunch ends. But please feel free, I think to reach out to, I think it's membership at bikehub.ca if you have additional questions. And I am more than happy to provide more details, my Python code, you know, the statistical analysis to anybody who's interested. So yeah, thank you all so much.
Amazing. Yeah, so before we finish, I would like to extend a big thank you to Angie for taking the time to present her findings with us today and explaining them and going through and answering all these questions. We'll be sending out the recording of this meeting in the next few days, as well as any additional resources Angie would like to share. We'll also send around links to Metro Vancouver cycling maps with Hub and Transit have produced as a result of the research Angie mentioned, as well as our benchmark report in case anyone is interested. If you like more ways to get involved in Hub or you enjoyed today's webinar, you can join Hub as a lifetime member for only a contribution of $10. The more members Hub has, the greater the impact when we advocate for better and safer biking. If you need more information, you can visit our website, bikehub.ca. Yeah, we're at the end of the webinar. Our facilitators will leave the meeting open for a few minutes for any of those who have extra comments. Please leave them in the chat. And yeah, thank you again, Angie. You may leave now if you wish and just enjoy your lunch. And participants, thank you so much for participating. You can log off now. Thank you.